So it's my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Kevin Bernstall, our moderator.
Thank you very much, Margie. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Our dead artist today has been called the Indiana Jones of war photography. His career has spanned nearly 20 years, 5 wars, and his swashbuckling exploits have been legendary throughout his life and after his death. Our artist today has spent his lifetime going from one hotspot to another, and today is no exception. Please welcome Mr. Robert Capa.
From one hotspot to another? Since I'm dead, what are you inferring?
No worries there, no worries there. But I must say, unfortunately, we have not eradicated war from our society, but we have gotten rid of indoor smoking. So I need to confiscate your cigarette. You can keep the film, but I need the cigarette. So anyway, thank you, Mr. Capa, for joining us. Please have a seat.
Call me Capa. This is why I'm here, correct? Don't suppose the audience would be interested in hearing about Andre Friedman from Budapest.
But you are Andre Friedman, born just before World War I on October 22, 1913 in Budapest, Hungary.
My good fortune. It's not enough to have talent. You'll also have to be born Hungarian.
And I understand that you were born with a 6th finger on one hand.
Which I had removed shortly after birth. Mama thought as a sign that I was destined for great things.
And speaking of your parents, they were non-practicing Jews who owned a successful dressmaking business in their home. Your mother, Julia, was shrewd, ambitious, the dominant figure in your family.
Mama was an empress at home. She was the CEO in our family business.
And Dezo, your Romanian father, was a tailor in Julia's shop. He was debonair, lighthearted, irresponsible, often leaving work with some petty cash in his pocket to play cards at a local cafe.
Papa believed it all came down to luck. Act like a winner. Never show your hand. Look the part.
Budapest was a city divided by wealth, class, and a bridge.
Buda was old world and old money. It was elegant, refined, discreet. It had earned its arrogance. We lived in Pest, where the action was. Artists and thinkers lived there. Pest put on a jaunty face, hoping you wouldn't notice its poverty.
You are the middle child, sandwiched between brothers Laszlo and Cornell. But you were your mother's favorite?
I was Mama's great love. Both my brothers and my father knew this. She made no effort to hide it.
You struggled in school, easily distracted, failing to do your homework. Why?
You'd call it ADHD? I'd call it hormones. I was much more interested in girls.
And you were introduced to photography and sex as a teenager. Both played a vital role in your life. A childhood friend, Eva Bessenu, introduced you to the camera, and your first sexual experience was with one of your mother's customers, who seduced you when you delivered her dress.
Naturally, I was a quick study. My appetite for both never left me.
Post-war Hungary was engulfed in a social political unrest, and at 17 you became involved in a leftist political group. You were brought in for questioning by the secret police.
The chief of police whistled Beethoven's Fifth, and I laughed in his face, and he knocked me unconscious.
Through your mother's connections, your release was secured on the condition that you leave Hungary within 24 hours.
I left for Berlin on a train. It was the first of my many gypsy wanderings.
Berlin, of course, was the cultural capital of Europe, the center of all that was modern and progressive. And with financial assistance from your parents, you enrolled in the School for Political Studies to take journalism classes.
I could see what was going on in the world, and I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to fight fascism with words.
So you took a room at a shabby hotel, a boarding house. Due to the depressed Hungarian economy, though, your parents were unable to continue their support, and you experienced hunger for the first time.
I stole veal cutlets from the landlady's dog. It didn't take long for her to realize why her pet dachshund was always whining for more food.
Evicted once your money ran out, you roamed the streets, sleeping on park benches at night.
I used to love the feeling of rain on my face, but now the rain went right to my shoes. I never thought that poverty had anything to do with feet, but now, every time I see a poor person, I look at their feet.
You connected with your childhood friend Ava, who set up a photography studio. Desperate to find work, you asked her if one could make a living as a photographer.
Ava told me that photography is a calling, not a profession. But it was the closest thing to journalism for someone who didn't speak German very well, so I decided to try it.
Well, Ava found you work at Dayfote, a prestigious agency whose images fed many of Germany's 2,500 newspapers and periodicals. You worked as a darkroom assistant for a year before you were given a camera. Simon Gutman, the agency's director at the time, sent you on your first assignment in December of 1932 to photograph exiled Soviet revolutionary Leon Trotsky, who was giving a speech in Copenhagen.
Trotsky had a price on his head, so security was tight. Press photographers were banned, but that didn't stop me. I hid my camera in my pocket and snuck in with some workers carrying sealed pipes. My little Leica and I had a date with Trotsky.
Your images of Trotsky captured his charisma and passion, and you were pleased to receive photo credit for them. Your photographs became known for their dramatic immediacy. With the success of your Trotsky photos, your assignments increased. However, with the rise of the Nazi Party, Berlin became a dangerous place. In 1933, you left for Paris, where thousands of Hungarian Jews had already found refuge from fascism.
I fled one step ahead of the brown shirts. Sooner or later, I'd be arrested and sent to a camp, or beaten to death by some golden-haired Hitler youth.
Penniless again, you hawked your Leica camera and fished in the Seine for food. A bright spot was meeting photographers David Chim Seymour and Henri Cartier-Bresson, who became lifelong friends and business associates.
We were the Three Musketeers. Jim was a chess player and philosopher, which made his photos complex and compassionate. Henri was a street photographer trying to escape his aristocratic roots. He wanted to capture the essence of the scene, the decisive moments. Me, I looked for passion in faces.
Yet each of you contributed a unique visual voice that helped shape what we now know as modern photojournalism.
You could take a pretty picture that people oohed and awed about, but we wanted more. We wanted to capture life as it happened, and all its emotion and power in one photo.
Simon Gutman, now the former editor of Dayfote, had relocated to Paris and found work for you photographing parades and street demonstrations. In 1934, you met journalist Gerda Pohorelli, a Jewish exile and fellow escapee from Nazi Germany. How did this feisty, fiercely independent Gerda play a pivotal role in advancing your career?
At the time, I was a scruffy little nobody. Gerda thought I was undisciplined and arrogant, but she saw I had potential. She cleaned me up and made a gentleman out of me. I wouldn't be the Robert Capa sitting here today without Gerda.
Well, our thanks to Gerda. You lived with Gerda then in an apartment near the Eiffel Tower. She introduced you to magazine editors, and you taught her how to take pictures.
Gerda gave as good as she got. She didn't smother me with affection. She knew I wasn't a faithful type, and she didn't try to change me. Truth is, I never loved anyone as much as I did Goethe. I believed only the pick and a spade could separate us.
Despite Goethe's tireless efforts on your behalf, photo assignments proved difficult. I hear you concocted a scheme.
We created the rich, successful, and elusive American photographer named Robert Capa, who was stationed in Europe. I took the photos, Goethe sold them, and Capa got the credit.
Ah.
Capa's photos sold for 3 times what Andre Friedman would have gotten.
So where did you get the name Robert Capa?
From Frank Capra, a movie director in America. Also, Capa was a childhood nickname. It means shark in Hungarian.
Ah. Goethe changed her name as well?
To Goethe Taro after Greta Garbo. My brother Cornell, who was also a photographer, changed his name to Capa as well. He kept the name of the family.
Your editor discovered that you were masquerading as Robert Capa, and he suggested that you stop the subterfuge and become Robert Capa from then on.
It was so freeing. It was like being born again, but without hurting my mother again.
The Spanish Civil War was a prelude to larger ideological conflicts between fascism, communism, and democracy. It would soon engulf Europe in World War II. Major news agencies deployed photojournalists to record the sights and sounds as they happened in real time. Their images were seen almost immediately in newspapers and magazines. These brave, intrepid photojournalists changed the nature of war photography, inventing the form that exists today.
If you called yourself an artist, you wouldn't get anything published. Call yourself a photojournalist, and you could do anything you wanted.
Mm-hmm. Well, during the summer of 1936, the editor of View magazine sent you and Goethe to Spain to focus on the loyalist troops. Your friend and fellow photographer, Chim, went as well.
The pictures were there, and you just took them. No tricks were necessary. You didn't pose the camera. The truth is the best picture, the best propaganda.
The Spanish Civil War, of course, was the first major conflict to be covered with the lightweight, fast-action 35mm camera, the Leica II. It was introduced in 1930. Liberated from the tripod, photographers were now mobile. Exposure times were made in fractions of seconds, and the film didn't need to be developed instantly, which allowed photographers to stay longer in the field.
My little Leica was my precious companion. It caught everything just as it happened.
The Spanish Civil War is also remembered as a testing ground for new 20th century technologies of warfare. You and Goethe arrived in Madrid in August 1936, and it was a city under siege, mercilessly threatened by planes sent by Hitler and Mussolini to aid in the fascist cause. What did you witness?
It was always the same. The sirens, the panic rush, the fracas of the bombs. And when the dust settled, people would go off to the morgue to see if the father, the mother, the son that didn't return home was on the casualty list. You know, it's not easy to stand aside and be unable to do anything except record the sufferings around one.
In September 1936, you traveled to the front lines near Cordoba, where you found crowds of villagers fleeing their homes as the fascists rained shells down on their town.
And when I got back to Paris, I found out I was a famous photographer because the camera that I held above my head had captured a man at the moment of death. And I didn't even know it.
Of course, you are talking about your photograph of the falling soldier, one of the most debated images in the history of photojournalism. Considered an iconic image on par with Goya's 3rd of May, 1808, and Picasso's Guernica, the falling soldier captures a man at the moment of death as he is hit by a bullet. Its authenticity has been questioned. Critics contend that it is nothing more than a man who lost his footing running down a hill, or that it was staged for the camera. Negatives or original prints have not survived. The location cannot be pinned down, and your version of events changed with the telling. Some believe that it was Gerda or Chim who actually took the photograph. Your response?
During one of the battles, I was in the trench with some Republican volunteers who were fanatical but ignorant fighters who shouted, "Viva la Repubblica!" each and every time they climbed over the parapet and charged a fascist machine gun. The machine gun would open fire and many of the men would be killed. The rest retreated back to the trench. Again and again, "Viva la Repubblica!" The machine gun would open fire. I timidly raised my camera above the parapet and pressed the button. I sent the picture to Paris undeveloped. It was 1,000,000 to 1 chance that I would capture a man at the moment of death.
But because of the circumstances and the implausible nature of your story, The Falling Soldier continues to be scrutinized by photographers. It remains a compelling detective story with too many moving parts and pieces to verify or prove.
It was at the beginning of my career and the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. War was romantic to me at the time, if you can say anything like that. Gutman and I came to Spain to take the truest and best pictures. And that is what we did.
Life magazine published the image in July 1937, transforming the falling soldier into a symbol of the Spanish conflict. It marked a turning point in your career, and from that moment on, you will forever be remembered as Robert Capa, the photographer who captured the very moment of a man's death.
The prize picture is born in the imagination of the editors and the public that sees them. I hated violence, and the thing I hated most was war. I wanted nothing to do with that photo. I hated it. I wanted nothing to do with an image that exploited death.
However, capturing intimate rather than grand moments became your signature style, wouldn't you say?
True, because the grand moments overshadow the real cost of war. We focused on the soldiers in the trenches, and we took the saddest faces, the mothers and the children who came back to their homes to find them destroyed and their friends torn apart in the rubble.
Your photographs set the tone for war reportage as it came to be practiced. You and Gerda traveled to Spain several times and developed a reputation for shooting photographs at great risk to your personal safety. Despite the constant danger, or perhaps because of it, this was one of the happiest times of your lives.
It was, but ironically, I remember what Goethe said. Goethe said, when you think about all the fine people that we knew who had been killed, you felt it was unfair to still be alive.
You met American writer Ernest Hemingway, who is in Spain reporting for the North American News Alliance and producing a pro-Republican film, The Spanish Earth. When Life magazine published a story of Hemingway's adventures, they used your photographs. And later you would celebrate the liberation of Paris and the end of World War II together. Tell us, what was he like?
He was Papa to us. That is how I thought of him. Here he was, a famous writer reporting from a trench or foxhole rather than some cozy bomb shelter. A real romantic hero.
In 1937, you returned to Paris on business while Gerda remained in Spain. Tired of living in your shadow, Gerda was determined to make her own name as a photojournalist. She was in Brunete, west of Madrid, to cover the Republican offensive, and there was artillery fire, bombs fell with heavy casualties. The general ordered her to leave, but she refused. She was on the running board of a car when a tank crashed into her, ripping her stomach open. Her last words were, "Are my cameras okay?"
I remember when I found out, I was in a dentist's chair, reading a newspaper. Then I turned the page and saw the headline, Taro killed in Brunete.
Gerda was the first female journalist to die in action, and the left-wing press canonized her as an anti-fascist saint. Her funeral occurred on what would have been her 26th birthday.
Oh my God.
It should never have happened. I left Gerda in danger. It would have never happened if I was there. She was safe when she was with me. I would have never allowed her to stand on a running board. That was a reckless thing to do. I would have never allowed it.
Photographer and friend Henri Cartier-Bresson remarked, and I quote, "The man who emerged after Gerda's death was more cynical, more opportunistic, afraid of attachment, and permanently brokenhearted."
Work was my only salvation. I spent 6 months in China following Japan's invasion of Manchuria. I was shooting stills and films for a documentary.
And it was there that you learned your first words of Chinese.
Bu Yao Kong. Don't look at the camera. I learned it in the language of every country I took photographs.
Good advice. Notably, you were the first photographer to shoot a war in color. Your assignments in China produced some of the most disturbing shots of your career. Children with protruding stomachs, pregnant mothers in blood and filth, Chinese digging their own graves under the supervision of Japanese soldiers, and Japanese soldiers practicing bayonet assaults on living Chinese. How did this affect you?
I went in search of my death, but did not find it. The best I could do was show the horrors that took Goethe away from me.
Your photographs of the early days of the Spanish Civil War were published while you were in China. Death in the Making would be the first of 4 books. Its express purpose was to advocate for the anti-fascist cause.
And it was dedicated to Goethe Taro, who spent 1 year on the Spanish front and who stayed on. Our work was never to make beautiful photographs. It was a political act.
Returning to Europe, you covered the Spanish War until its end in 1939. 26 dramatic frontline photographs were featured in the December 3, 1938 Picture Post spread, which declared, "Robert Capa, the greatest war photographer in the world." You were 26 years old.
It has always been my philosophy that if your pictures aren't good enough, then you aren't close enough. My pictures told a story, and I never claimed to be impartial.
Flash forward for a moment here. In 2007, a suitcase containing 4,500 negatives of the Spanish Civil War taken by Gerda, Chim, and you was discovered in Mexico. Assumed lost since 1939, the images and the story became the subject of a documentary film, The Mexican Suitcase. What's the backstory there?
Siki Weiss, my partner during the Spanish Civil War, saved them. When I left all the negatives in Paris when the Germans were approaching France, Siki put them into a rucksack and bicycled them to Bordeaux to put on a ship going to Mexico. A true lost and found story if there ever was
I
one.
should say so. On September 1, 1939, 1.5 million German troops invaded Poland. 2 days later, France and Britain were at war with Germany, and with the Nazi occupation of France, you left Paris and joined your mother and brother Cornell in New York. Hired first by Collier's magazine and later Life magazine, you became the only enemy alien, you were a Hungarian and Hungary was an Axis power, granted access to cover the Allied troops. Then in late 1942, you went to North Africa as a correspondent.
I was surprised when nobody wanted to check my papers when they heard my exotic accent. I got a lot of dirt in my lenses and was scared in my stomach, but I kept shooting.
The helmet that you carried through the 1943 Italian campaign was inscribed, "Robert Capa, great war correspondent and lover."
When death stares you down, give it the finger.
T-shirts with that will be available later. Leaving Africa, you parachuted into Sicily with the Allied forces when they invaded in the summer of 1943. Take us there.
We got ready to be dropped behind enemy lines. The plane was shaking as badly as we were. One of the soldiers turned to me and said, "I wouldn't have your job for anything. Too damn dangerous."
Your coverage of the 1st Division provided the definitive images of America's 21-day battle to capture Sicily. You entered the town with mine detector squads the day it was captured. Describe that for us.
I found a town of horror, alive with weeping men, women, and children who had stayed through 2 days of bombing and shelling and watching their friends die, and whatever was left pillaged by the departing Nazis.
You were one of 4 photographers chosen to cover the first days of the United States Army assault on Hitler's Europe.
I remember my father's advice, so I raced back to my London apartment with just enough time to buy a Burberry raincoat and a Dunhill silver flask. No matter the danger, I would make the most elegant invader of all.
Dress for the job you want. Packed in waterproof oilskins were your Contax cameras, the Rolleiflex, the Speed Graflex, and the telephoto lens.
My Contax constant companions. You didn't have to stop in the middle of a battle to look through the lens to take a picture. You could shoot away knowing you would get something good.
On June 6, 1944, more than 160,000 Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy. It remains the largest amphibious invasion in history and struck a critical blow to the Nazis, hastening the end of World War II. It was also one of the bloodiest battles, resulting in the loss of 2,400 American lives by the end of the first day. You alone were selected from dozens in the press pool to land with the first wave on Omaha Beach on D-Day. You knew that if you survived, it would be the biggest exclusive of your career. Walk us through that day.
The coast of Normandy was still miles away when the first unmistakable popping reached our ears. We tucked down into the puke-filled water at the bottom of the barge. Some men cheered. Others recited the Lord's Prayer. When the flat bottom of our barge hit the earth of France, the men waded into the water, waist deep, ready to shoot. It was overcast, but still light enough to take pictures. I took out my contacts.
As you recounted in your memoir, one of the crew mistook your picture taking for hesitation and gave you a swift kick in the rear. You hit the frigid water with the bullets tearing holes in the water around you.
Men were falling. I had to push past their bodies, which I did, politely. I went in very elegant with my Burberry raincoat in my left hand. I soon realized I couldn't do my job if I were a fashionable corpse, so I let go of it and it floated away. All around me, bodies floated in a sea of blood and vomit. In front of me, hundreds of men were dying and screaming, body parts flying everywhere. I gathered my guts for the last jump to the beach.
As shells exploded around you and the water became clogged with corpses, you found shelter behind a tank. The tide was coming in, and the water reached a farewell letter to your family you kept in your breast pocket. Covered by 2 soldiers, you reached the beach.
I came nose to nose with a lieutenant who asked me if I saw what he saw. And I said no. And he said, "I'll tell you what I see. I see my mother back home, sitting on the front porch, waving my insurance policy."
For several minutes, you lay still with your body pressed as close as possible to the sand.
It was a new kind of fear. And the camera trembled in my hands, and the fear was shaking my head from head to toe and twisting my face.
And you found that the only way you could control your body was to shoot pictures, which you did without raising your head.
Shooting from that angle, the foreground of my pictures were filled with wet boots and green faces.
You spotted a medical transport boat about 50 yards out to sea. A group of medics jumped out and were quickly mowed down by machine gun fire. You made a run for it.
I went back into that bloody water again, with my cameras above my head trying to keep them dry.
And just as you were pulled aboard, the boat was hit by German artillery, killing or wounding many. Climbing aboard, you found yourself covered in feathers?
I remember thinking, was somebody killing chickens? I looked up and the boat had taken a direct hit, and many of the men had been blown up. Body parts were strewn around. The feathers were the stuffing from the jackets of the men who had been blown up. The skipper was crying because his assistant who had been blown up, and he was covered in his guts.
As the boat pulled away, you retired to the engine room to put fresh film in your camera. Returning to the deck, you took one last shot of the smoke-shrouded beach and another of an emergency plasma transfusion on the deck. Your legs gave way and you collapsed. You had been on Omaha Beach for only 90 minutes.
I woke up in a bunk, naked, covered with a rough blanket. There was a note around my neck. It read, "Exhaustion case, no dog tags."
You arrived in England the following day and were surrounded by reporters eager to get that first-hand account of the invasion. You put your film in a courier's pouch, changed into dry clothes, and hitched a ride on the first boat returning to Omaha Beach to photograph the aftermath.
The high tide line was covered with body parts, rifles, scattered kits, and Bibles. There were the latest letters from home, razors, toothbrushes, and pictures of loved ones from back home staring up at you from the sand.
The rolls of film from Omaha Beach were transported to London to be developed. Once a military censor approved the negatives, they were flown to the New York offices of Life magazine, where captions were written for the images.
A week later, I found out that while drying out the negatives, the darkroom assistant, in his excitement, turned on too much heat and destroyed the emulsions. Out of over 100 photos that I took, only 11 survived.
The surviving photos have been called the Magnificent 11 and became the collective vision of the pivotal battle. Life magazine printed 10 of the frames in its June 19th, 1944 issue under the headline, "The Fateful Battle for Europe is Joined by Sea and Air." Captions described the photographs as slightly out of focus because Capa's hands were shaking. Later, filmmaker Steven Spielberg would say that the pictures inspired the opening sequence for his film Saving Private Ryan. But the story didn't end there. Much like the controversy surrounding Falling Soldier, your D-Day photographs have come under scrutiny. Critics say that you went to Omaha Beach much later than you claimed. The German defenses at your landing site were, in fact, rather light, and you would not have been under heavy fire as you reported. The number of exposures you took has been contested, and the claim that the negatives were destroyed by heat is technically impossible. Many contend that in actuality only 11 photos were taken that day. Your response?
I don't remember seeing any of those critics on the beach. Perhaps I was guilty of embellishment. I was on Omaha Beach and would never lie about the fundamental truth of that day. For me, it was first and foremost a human story.
As the Allies swept through Europe in April of 1945, you said that you had no interest in covering the so-called looting war, nor any desire to document the liberation of the concentration camps.
The camps were swarming with photographers, and every new photo of horror only served to diminish the total effect. For a short time, everyone saw what happened to those poor devils in those camps, but few cared what happened to them in the future.
Instead, then, you chose to accompany the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division as it approached the Zeppelin Bridge in Leipzig, Germany. It was there that you took one of your last and most poignant photographs of the war.
The war was almost over. It's like an actress getting older, less and less photogenic and more dangerous. I decided to take one last photo. There was a young soldier setting up a machine gun on the balcony. He was so clean cut, like it was the first day of the war. As I was raising up my camera to take a picture of him, a German sniper got him. It was so clean and beautiful, his death. And I think that is what I remember most about the war.
The setting also held a personal meaning for you.
Goethe had lived in Leipzig. Here I was in Leipzig, photographing another young person struck down in war before their time.
It is a picture depicting the pointlessness of war.
Very much so. I knew that when I took that photo, the day after, people would begin to forget.
So you sought physical release from the trauma of war in sex. An equal opportunity Casanova, you cultivated both aristocrats and hookers.
I would go after any woman, regardless of race, creed, color, age, weight, height, nationality, marital status, eye color, hair color. I treated women like my cameras. A new one came and went with every new assignment. And every camera has its own special features, just like every woman.
Well, one woman who nearly changed that pattern was the Swedish actress Ingrid Bergman. You met her at the Hotel Ritz in Paris in June of 1945 while she was entertaining the U.S. troops.
Erwin Shaw, the writer, and I slipped a note underneath her door. It said we could afford to send her some flowers or take her to dinner, but not both. She accepted our invitation, stating that she would rather dine out than sit in a hotel room staring at a vase of flowers.
So when Ingrid was free, you explored Paris together. She also accompanied you to Berlin, which had been the capital of Nazi Germany and was naturally suffered catastrophic bombing. And despite the sometimes grim nature of your post-war explorations, you delighted in each other's company and shared a similar sense of humor.
Ingrid was a painting come to life, but as beautiful as she was, that was not the main attraction. Ingrid made me laugh more than any woman I had ever met.
A married woman with a child, however, Ingrid fell deeply in love. And as one of her biographers put it, Ingrid was desperately addicted to Capa. He was the kind of man she had known only in movie scripts.
She got under my skin too. I'd been called a heartless vulture when it came to women, but getting close could hurt me a hell of a lot more than any war injury could.
Well, Ingrid returned to the United States to make the film Notorious with Alfred Hitchcock. You reluctantly followed her, becoming a still photographer on the set, and you also found time to appear in a B movie as an Egyptian in the film Temptation. You grew disenchanted, though, with Hollywood and the superficial glamour it represented.
Hollywood was the biggest piece of shit I'd ever stepped in.
Well, I'm sorry to report that it is even a bigger piece today. So despite warnings from her friends that you were a penniless womanizer and a gambler, Ingrid proposed marriage. She was ready to leave her husband and her child and her career in Hollywood and leap off into the unknown with you.
I told Ingrid I couldn't tie myself down. If they said Korea tomorrow, and we were married, and we had a child, I wouldn't be able to go. That would be impossible.
After a passionate 2-year affair, you parted company. Alfred Hitchcock wrote and directed the film Rear Window, inspired by your affair with Ingrid. And you advised Ingrid to break from the golden cage of Hollywood and seek more creative projects. How? How so?
I told Ingrid that if she wanted to be a true artist, she should work with a director that made her do things that scared her. Not long after we broke up, she wrote Roberto Rossellini, the Italian director, offering her services. Not long after, she left her husband and Hollywood for Rossellini to begin her new life in Italy.
And we all know how that turned out. You became a United States citizen in 1946. Congratulations. And in 1947, General Dwight D. Eisenhower awarded you the Medal of Freedom for your photographic documentation of World War II. Your memoir, Slightly Out of Focus, was published that year. Critics deprecated it, saying it was highly fictionalized and a vanity tool to perpetuate your own myth.
You can imagine that reliving those experiences was tough. So I allowed myself to go slightly beyond and slightly sideways of the truth.
The happy-go-lucky persona you displayed to the public hid signs of what we now diagnose as post-traumatic stress disorder. Restlessness, heavy drinking, depression, survivor's guilt, and self-destructive tendencies. You took to gambling, frequenting the racetrack and the poker table, and it wasn't uncommon for you to lose a 6-month salary in one evening.
I'd put on a jaunty afternoon smile and pretended everything was okay. It was off to the next bar, or the next round of cards, no matter how late the hour, or the next war, no matter how ugly it might be. When I went to sleep, my dreams were filled with death, all the deaths that I had seen and couldn't stop seeing.
So in 1947, you co-founded Magnum Photos with photographers Cartier-Bresson, David Seymour, Chim, William Vandervert, and George Roger. Magnum was a cooperative photo agency which allowed its members to maintain copyrights of their images.
For years, my Life magazine photos had been captioned to suit the editor's view of the world. Why be exploited by others? Let's exploit ourselves.
At Magnum, you mentored young photographers, including Eve Arnold, Inga Morath, and Mark Rybold. You gave generously of your time, counseling them on both matters, aesthetic and practical, and you advised them to make themselves inconspicuous and to always have an image in mind, and you suggested that they look at pictures upside down to judge composition.
Most importantly, I told them to watch out for labels. They're reassuring at first, but sooner or later, someone is going to put one on you that you'll never get rid of, and you'll be lost. Soon you'll be precious and mannered.
Above all, Magnum offered photographers what you valued most, artistic freedom. Ernest Haas, a Magnum photographer, found you and your work inspirational, and he believed that you had created a poetry of war, albeit a tragic poetry.
I always considered my work anti-poetry, anti-sentimental, anti-religion, but that was all tough talk. What I was saying with my photos was, I was there, and I wanted you to feel that you were there too. You wouldn't have felt it if I had just parachuted in and out.
In the summer of 1947, you accompanied writer John Steinbeck on a tour of the Soviet Union during the early days of the Cold War. Steinbeck was asked why he needed a photographer on the trip, as there were many in the Soviet Union. And he replied that if the project was to be done at all, it must be a collaboration. And he added, "There are no Capas in Russia."
It was an old-fashioned Don Quixote and Sancho Panza quest. to ride behind the Iron Curtain and pit our lances and pens against the windmills of today. John and I set out to see how the real people of Russia lived and not make some dry political analysis.
Russian officials, though, suspected you were agents carrying out a mission for the United States government, and you were watched closely as you traveled through the so-called vodka circuit, Moscow, Kiev, Stalingrad, and Georgia, for 40 days, documenting the people you encountered.
The Soviets saw us as an opportunity to present their nation as harmonious, industrious, and productive. But I'd always find ways to circumvent the red tape and get good pictures. But shaking off our handlers was damned near impossible.
Yes, and on, quote, official tours, you had to leave your cameras on the bus, and some of your film was confiscated before you boarded the flight home. But despite such roadblocks, you managed to shoot 4,000 pictures in less than 40 days, and a few hundred were in color.
It was so humiliating. Everywhere were wonderful images, contrasts and angles, and pictures with meaning beyond their meaning. I could have shown more than thousands of words could say.
So published as a syndicated newspaper serial and as a book in April of 1948, Russian Journal presented the Soviet Union in a positive light. Reviews were mixed. It was criticized as superficial and downplaying the ruthless nature of Stalin's authoritarian regime.
Nice pictures, they said. Too bad about the contrived narrative. The project was a failure. I felt like a failure.
Although the Russian trip did pay well, $2,000 a week, in the long run it cost you. In the post-war climate of fear, the FBI saw the trip as further evidence that you were in league with communists. And they added incriminating evidence and information to a file that they had kept on you since the 1930s.
I hated the vicious and insane game of stupid accusations and violent criticism. It was not important who started it, but what was important was who was going to stop it.
Amen. You moved among a fabled and eclectic group of friends that included decorated military heroes, American literary figures Ernest Hemingway and Truman Capote, Hollywood actors Gary Cooper and Humphrey Bogart, and artists Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse.
Generals, movie stars, chambermaids, I treated everyone the same. Friends helped me forget the loneliness of the night before and the night ahead.
You've been described as a chameleon, a rakish charmer with a wicked look in your eye. You animated every gathering with your irresistible zest and mischievous humor. And you spoke Capanese, a fusion of Hungarian, German, French, and English. Off-duty, you enjoyed the life of a sensualist, wearing bespoke suits, drinking vintage champagne, and dining at the best restaurants.
The kind of life I led, you could lose at any moment. So you think, what the hell? I'll enjoy it while I can.
Your home base in Paris was the Lancaster Hotel, and your day began with a long soak in the tub, reading detective novels or racing forums. After placing bets, it was off to the racetracks or enjoying a leisurely lunch with a good bottle of Burgundy. Afternoons were reserved for sex. Dinner at one of Paris's best restaurants was followed by a late-night poker game. An incurable bohemian, it seems inconceivable that you would consider marriage or move to the suburbs.
I wasn't looking for security. The idea of settling down with one woman for the rest of my life and being in one place, that represented a slow death.
A digression here, an interesting side note. You are credited with coining the term Generation X. You used it as a title to a photo essay about young men and women growing up immediately after the Second World War.
We gave a name to this unknown generation, the Generation X. We found that in our first enthusiasm, we had something far bigger than our talents and pockets could cope with.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Boomer. You were prescient about the growing importance of the moving image, specifically television.
Television was going to change everything. I suggested that Magnum photographers start carrying movie cameras because if a photo can say 1,000 words in any language, then a movie camera can can tell a story in every language.
In 1948, you went to Israel to photograph the War of Independence and the declaration of the Jewish state. Over the next 2 years, you documented the waves of immigration, the transit camps, and the deep uncertainty facing the newly formed nation.
There were 2 countries in the world where 2 minutes after you reached their border, you were asked your opinion of them. The first was the Soviet Union, and the other was Israel. They were the only 2 countries who had the right to such zeal. They were the only ones who created something new, unlike anything else.
Some of the most dynamic pictures of your career were taken in Israel. You covered the spectrum of emotion and experience, and one moment you're joining exuberant crowds thronging the streets, and the next you were dodging sniper fire.
The road to Jerusalem was a road to death. I had never seen so many dead and dying children littered about the streets. One moment, I saw 12 schoolboys singing, and the next, one of them was screaming in pain. I saw a little girl gazing stunned at the stump of her arm.
During one furious battle, a bullet grazed your groin, and for a few seconds you feared that your genitals had been shot away.
That would have been the final insult, being killed by the Jews.
Your photographs of Israel are lyrical and marked by an immediacy and a warmth and an intimacy with your subject. They appeared in This Israel by the journalist I.F. Stone in 1948, and the same year you co-authored Report on Israel with Irwin Shaw. You returned to Israel in 1950 to make a fundraising film for the United Jewish Appeal on the arrival, the internment, and the eventual settlement of immigrants.
Israel was a personal war for me, and I put my heart into those pictures. After all, I was one of them, a wandering Jew who had fled Hungary from Berlin to Paris and to the United States.
So you returned to Paris and made the decision with other members of Magnum Agency that you would no longer cover wars.
A war photographer has his stake, his life in his own hands. And he can put it on this horse, or he can put it on this horse, or he can put it back into his pocket at the last moment. In war, you must hate somebody, or you must love somebody. You must have a position, or you cannot stand what goes on. If I had to go back to war again, I'd shoot myself because I'd seen too much.
Seeking to renew your passport in 1952, you were surprised to find it retained by the government. The reason, you were told, is that you were a suspected communist. With the help of influential friends, your passport is reinstated until October of 1954 for all countries except those behind the Iron Curtain.
My past had caught up with me. Hungary, Berlin, Spain, Russia, my name change. I had to explain everything. I was never a communist. I was against fascism, nothing more.
There was speculation, though, that you had made a deal to regain your passport by providing information to the CIA.
Robert Capa, a male Matahari. I could never do that. I would keep forgetting what the mission was.
And you look nothing like Greta Garbo. In the spring of 1954, you traveled to Japan with a Magnum exhibition, and you found Japan a photographer's paradise and felt rejuvenated. Throughout the 6-week trip, children were your primary subjects, but out of the blue, you were contacted by Life magazine to be a sub for one of their photographers covering the French War in Indochina.
I needed the cash. I had medical expenses, legal expenses, and I'd been borrowing heavily from Magnum. The assignment paid $2,000 a month, and a $25,000 Lloyd's of London life insurance policy was thrown in for good measure. It was too good to pass up.
But despite pressure from your family and Magnum members not to go, you accepted the offer.
A war photographer's most fervent wish is for unemployment. But I was a gambler, and I decided I'd do a photo essay, juxtaposing pictures of peasants in the Delta against the military activity. I call it Bitter Rice.
So taking your contacts and Nikon 5, you joined two Time Life correspondents who accompanied the French troops. On May 25, 1954, the regiment headed out on what promised to be an exciting day. You prepared a flask of cognac and a thermos of iced tea.
I promised to be on my best behavior. I would not insult my fellow colleagues, and not once would I mention the excellence of my work.
That morning, the regiment crossed the Red River. Shots rang out and everyone ducked for cover. You photographed the peasants who continued to pick rice, oblivious to the commotion. That afternoon, in the midst of heavy fighting, you decided to leave the Jeep and go up the road on foot.
The story was almost done. I decided to go up the road a bit.
5 minutes later, there was an explosion. You had stepped on a landmine. Soldiers found you on your back, barely alive. Your leg was blown to pieces, and you had a serious chest wound. Taken to a field hospital, you were pronounced dead at 3:10 p.m. You were 40 years old. You died with your Contax camera clutched in your left hand. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to now direct your attention to the on-screen epilogue. Robert Capa was the first American correspondent killed in what was to become the Vietnam War. More than 100 other journalists would eventually join him. We now present several quotes, one from journalist Alex Capshaw and one from Robert's brother Cornell Capa. You may read those in a moment of silence. Before we go into our next section here, I just want to remind anyone that is comfortable doing so, you may stay after if you have any questions or anything you want to hear from our artist today or from me. We'll be happy to try to answer this for you. Next, Mr. Capa, we come to the final part of our program, a series of questions based on journalist Bernard Pivot's famous questionnaire, if I may. What is your favorite word?
Capture. In my line of profession, I always tried to capture the essence of the scene, the emotion, what it felt like to be there, what was going on. I wanted you to feel like you were there. So, capture.
What is your least favorite word?
It is actually two words, and it is a phrase I hope to never hear again. Acceptable losses.
What sound or noise do you love?
The click of the shutter on a camera.
Understandable. What sound or noise do you hate?
The sound of someone screaming out for their loved ones as they die.
What is your favorite curse word?
Shit. Za. Scheiße. Merd. Mierda. No matter how you say it, in what language, everyone knows what you are talking about.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
To be a journalist or perhaps a novelist. But writing and language was never my strong suit.
What profession other than your own would you not like to attempt?
Soldier. I was never good at taking orders.
If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Whoa. Goethe is waiting for you with your Leica, and I have a photo job for you. I want you to go back to all the countries that you took photos at before the wars happened and take pictures of birthdays, weddings, and family gatherings.
Very good. That concludes our presentation today. Please join me in thanking Mr. Rowland.